Although the Great Awakening was very popular in the 18th century American religious life, it didn't go without its critics. And there are really three key points of critique that are offered against it. One is that the revivalist movement in here really focuses, it appears to on the surface, to deal much more with emotion experiences over moral conversion. Even though Edwards tries to rebut this in his own defense of the Great Awakening, there's a real strand of Christian thinking at this time, especially in Anglican circles, that preaching really ought to focus on the development of moral habits rather than on people knowing they're saved. That there's an assumption of Christendom at play here, that yes, one is baptized into the body of Christ, and then there's a gradual perfection of virtue that happens beginning in childhood. And so his focus on emotion experience sort of undercuts this other prevailing notion that preaching in the Christian life ought to focus on moral conversion. Another aspect here that goes along with this is a Christian assumption that the highest religious state, the highest way of being a fully awakened person, lies within rationality, because the intellect is understood to be the highest part of the person. This goes really far back in the Christian tradition, where thinkers argued that what it means to be made in the image and likeness of God has obviously nothing to do with physicality or corporeality, but rather with being able to think and reason in ways that are analogous to how the mind of God operates. And so the idea is in religious services, rational intellectual processes are to be emphasized because that is where God is accessed analogically most clearly. And finally, there's discomfort with the way in which the emotional aspects, the affectivity of these preaching events and worship events could perhaps upend the social order. Decorum falls away, divisions recede as the fervor of the revival takes hold. All these concerns really fit neatly into assumptions that Anglicanism broadly held. And we can see in a particular figure that I had you read for this week, Charles Woodmason's critique of Great Awakening revivalism. And Charles Woodmason is a minister for a parish in South Carolina. He is grappling with his parishioners being drawn away from the right, orderly, refined worship of his parish towards the emotional, affective revivalism around them. And so he delivers a teaching to them where he really tries to uphold Anglican worship on the American colonial frontier. And he lays out a couple of markers of what Anglican piety ought to look like in this context, in contrast with this revivalism. So he says, we ought to have a real emphasis on reverence and decorum. And there ought to be silence in church rather than this great commotion, because that signals respect for God and respect for worshipers who are trying to intellectually commune with God. Members of the parish ought to abstain from worship at other churches that he identifies as schismatic, as separated from the church. He defines schismatic here as churches that deny the 39 Articles. Now, that would be most other churches in a colonial context. But we see a sense here of Anglicanism marking itself out as distinct from Presbyterianism or Baptist movements in particular. Woodmason also argues that a well-constructed sermon reflects the gifts of reason that God has given humans, And this is much better than the extemporaneous sermons that are becoming increasingly common at these revivalist events. And then finally, he argues that the Church of England represents the greatest sort of continuity with the early church. That whatever these revivalist movements are up to, they don't reflect the apostolic teachings that the Church of England has guarded through its own life, worship, and polity. And so a real emphasis here on conformity in contrast to the ways in which Great Awakening events broke down distinctions between forms of Christian belonging. So we see the Great Awakening then being a real challenge for Anglicanism in a frontier context in the American colonies. Alongside these critiques, we can also think about the effects that the Great Awakening had on various people. And one of the things that we're noticing with the Great Awakening is the way it can break down social divisions. And so we can ask, what does this mean for women? What does this mean for non-Anglo-Europeans? What does this mean for, say, people of color, enslaved people, indigenous people, free people of color in this context? So one of the things to note then is that the emphasis on personal conversion as kind of a first marker means that one's identity is not based on institutional markers of being of English or European ancestry, of male gender, possession of property, being enslaved or in bondage versus being freed. What this then means is that women and African Americans are able to take on leadership through the Great Awakening movements within the context of their social circles. We see this already at play a bit in the narrative we had of Rebecca Proton, even though that's unfolding in a pietist context. So let's turn our attention to a figure who I think represents this well, Phillis Wheatley. Phillis Wheatley was born in what's now the Gambia. She arrives in Boston, Massachusetts as a child, and she is enslaved from a young age. Phillis Wheatley is one of our earliest published poets, I believe our first published female poet in the Americas. She is really a literary sensation in her own lifetime. Her poetry is really remarkable insofar as it's informed by a couple of very clear strands of thinking in the mid-18th century New England. She's clearly informed by classical forms of poetry that we could discern in the great Latin poets. She is really clearly informed about Christian theology as she writes. But she also appears to be part of this broader revivalist Great Awakening movement. One example of this is in New England at the time in which she is active. There is a school of theology known as the New Divinity. And they teach, this arises out of Congregationalism, and so a kind of Reformed theology. And the New Divinity teaches that a doctrine known as disinterested benevolence. And there's a theologian by the name of Samuel Hopkins who is prominent with this. And the notion of disinterested benevolence is the idea that one should be willing to suffer for God's glory. The idea is that God eventually seeks to bring all things, good things, out of evil things. So, as one is suffering, one ought to be looking for signs about how God is bringing some sort of good out of this. This is really a way for Reformed theologians to grapple with the doctrine of divine providence and the doctrine of election with the notion that God will do good for the elect, even if they appear to be suffering at the present moment. So we can see this reflected in a poem that Phillis Wheatley writes titled On Being Brought from Africa to America, which really appears to be expressing some of this notion of disinterested benevolence. I want to read this poem for you again. This is in our Griffith book, American Religions, on page 122. It's a short poem. "'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand that there's a God, that there's a Savior too. Once I redemption neither sought nor knew. Some view our sable race with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolic dye. Remember, Christians, Negroes, black as Cain, may be refined and join the angelic train." So this short poem of about 10 lines really, I think, condenses some really key aspects of thinking in the middle of the 18th century. This notion of God acting for Phillis Wheatley in what appears to be a massive tragedy. Her being stolen from her family, her being sold into bondage, being brought to Boston. And yet there's a notion that taught her that God exists and that Jesus exists to redeem her. That is a real, I think, distillation of this notion of disinterested benevolence. But there's another side of this, which I would argue is a critique of slavery and a critique of anti-black racism in the middle of the 18th century among these so-called upstanding Christians who would still choose to enslave other people and to see those who are not of European ancestry as somehow inferior. This notion of the color of skin as somehow reflecting a moral quality, this so-called diabolic dye. And this kind of rejoinder to Christians that even if you are going to look at another group of people as inferior, you still need to contend with the fact that they're created in the image of God and can attain all that those of European ancestry can attain. And so there is an element here of critique of Christianity and of its racist assumptions and its dominant mode, while also embracing a really specific form of Christian doctrine, this notion of disinterested benevolence. I think there's a lot more for us to say about this poem. I hope we can read it again in class and that we can further analyze and interrogate it, because I think Phillis Wheatley is pointing us towards a very early instance of Black resistance to racism, and an early instance of a kind of liberative theology in African American Christian thinking. A final key element, just to conclude this section, that is an effect of the Great Awakening, is denominational realignment. Once you begin to focus on conversion as an adult, as the key marker, practices of infant baptism make less and less sense. And so there becomes a general movement towards thinking adult baptism is preferable within an evangelical perspective. So this leads many people to turn towards membership in Baptist churches. Methodism also really begins to take off in the American colonies, because as Methodist churches are good at helping to organize religious life. I just said here Methodist churches. I really meant Methodist groups or societies, because the Methodist church itself is not established until the 1780s. What this means, though, is that we see a further establishment of distinct patterns of Christian Protestant belonging in this time period, because there becomes an overarching assumption that your own personal theology ought to drive the kind of religious affiliation you have. And we can even think of a countervailing example of this, is that Anglicanism actually really begins to take off in New England in the 1740s as the Great Awakening gains momentum, because certain congregants in New England are really repelled by this revivalism, and the Church of England has become legalized or allowed to operate in the New England colonies to a degree it hadn't been before. And this leads to a real explosion of growth in Church of England parishes, especially in Massachusetts and Connecticut. So some people are leaving, on the one hand, Anglican churches for, say, a Presbyterian, a Methodist, or a Baptist church in some regions, like, say, the Carolinas or Virginia. And then other regions, people are leaving Congregationalist churches for Anglican churches. So part of what the Great Awakening does, by emphasizing adult discernment of religious affiliation, is it helps to reorient the religious landscape of American colonial Protestantism. As the frontier begins to push westward, due to wars with indigenous groups and the French colonial powers, the churches that are going to succeed most in the frontier are those that can be flexible with how worship is configured and how church is understood to operate. So Baptists and Methodists in particular really flourish in frontier contexts, whereas church bodies emphasize more formal organization, especially Anglican and Presbyterian, are going to be at more of a disadvantage. So I hope we now are beginning to get a better sense of how religion is shifting and developing in the 18th century. And this sets us up well for considering the final piece of this week's material, which is what happens in the context of the American Revolution and the development of notions of religious liberty as enshrined within the United States Constitution.